now on irregular verbs. So what is an irregular verb? Well, they're verbs that don't follow a pattern. So there's no adding D or ED at the end of the word. So let's have a look at an example. I gave him the medicine. The verb is give, and we've changed it to gave. Another example. They ate everything. And this is the verb to eat, and we've changed it completely to ate. Another example. He got up really late. And this is the verb get that we've changed. And as you can see, with these irregular verbs, there is no pattern. It will be a chance to expose learners to them in the classroom, to revise, to review and to consolidate, because as there are no rules, they will need plenty of opportunity to practice. Let's have a look at a few more examples. Do will change to did. Put stays the same in the past and remains put. Grow changes to grew. Have changes to had. And know changes to knew. So it's very common for your students to forget some of the irregular verbs, and you will find what they actually do is sometimes add ed to them because they don't distinguish between regular and irregular verbs. So don't be surprised to hear in your class your students say eated or knowed or putted. Learners need regular exposure and practice to raise awareness of the differences between regular and irregular verbs. Now let's look at a different type of verb, and this is called an auxiliary verb. An auxiliary verb has no meaning alone, but it works alongside a main verb. The word auxiliary comes from Latin, and this means to help. So think of an auxiliary verb as a helping verb to the main verb. So if we look at main verbs and auxiliary verbs, the main verb tells us what happened. And there are usually 4 forms of the verb. So again, we have our base form. So an example would be talk. We have our third person singular, which would be talks, because we're adding an S. We have our past simple ed or past participle, that would be talked. And then talking, the ing form. With an irregular verb, we could have go, that changes to goes in the third person. Then we have went in the past, gone, which is the third form or the past participle, and going in the ing form. The auxiliary verbs or modal auxiliary verbs add extra meaning. So examples of these would be can, could, may, might. And auxiliaries are used to make structures. So be, have, and do are going to be our focus. So if we focus on the 3 main auxiliary verbs, or helping or supporting verbs, the verb do, the verb be, and the verb have. So if we look at the verb do, we often use this to make questions. For example, do you eat meat? Do you fancy a bite to eat? Do you play tennis? With be, we use this to form continuous tenses, sometimes known as progressive. Continuous tenses, the present continuous, are formed with the auxiliary verb to be and the ing form of the verb. So he is sitting at the table. Is the verb to be. They were waving goodbye, and were is an example of the verb to be. We also use the verb to be with the passive voice. So the passive voice is formed with the auxiliary verb to be plus the past participle of the main verb. So an example would be, it is being fixed, with is representing the verb to be. And then we have the auxiliary verb have. And we use this auxiliary verb to make perfect tenses. Perfect tenses are formed with the auxiliary verb to have plus our past participle. So for example, I have finished my project. We have the verb to have and we have finished, which is our past participle. Another example, she has been studying Turkish for 6 years. Has is an example of the verb have. And then we have our past participle. Let's have a look at an example. Main verbs and auxiliary verbs. So, let's have a look at this question. Can I give you a lift? So, can is our auxiliary verb, our helping verb. And give is our main verb. So remember, the modal auxiliary can adds extra meaning, and in this sentence is used to offer combined with the main verb give. So can is offering. Let's have a look at a further example. Should we remind her? So if we look at this example, should is our modal verb, and it's asking someone's view. And then we have the verb remind. So what is a modal verb? A modal verb is an auxiliary verb or a helping verb. So modals help express the mood in a sentence. And we can use modal verbs to talk about many things: possibility, ability, permission, obligation, requests, and prohibition. Some facts about modal verbs. They do not take the S in the third person singular. So we say he plays tennis, which is great. But we cannot say she plays tennis. We say she can play tennis. There is no S on the modal verb can. Modal verbs are followed directly by an infinitive of another verb, with no to in between. An example: she should follow her instincts. Modal verbs never change when they conjugate. So as we said, he plays is the present simple and we add the S. But if we're using the modal verb can, it always stays the same. He can. Modal verbs appear at the beginning of a question. Let's look at some examples. Can you open the window? Or could you pass me the salt? Let's focus specifically on the modal verb can and all of the different ways that we can use it. Listen to these sentences. I can surf. I can play chess. This is using can for ability. We can also use can to request something. Can you pass me the bread? Can you close the door? We can also use can as an offer. Can I help you? Can I get you a drink? For prohibition, you can't park here. You can't smoke in here. And for permission, you can leave now or you can see him now. So one of the easiest modal verbs to start with for lower level learners is can for ability. You can ask and answer simple questions such as, can you play tennis? Yes, I can. No, I can't. Can you play golf? Yes, I can. No, I can't. It's actually easier for students than other questions as there is no change in the third person. So remember, he can, there's no addition of an S. Let's focus on another modal verb, must. So we can use must for certainty and deduction. He must be French. For obligation, you must do your homework. And for deduction and evidence, you must be tired after your trip. So think about using must as a classroom activity at the beginning of term. What must you do in class and what you must not do? This can be a useful activity. Give a list of what learners must and must not do, and then they give you a list of what they must and must not do. And this can be a useful way to compromise with them. Have it displayed on your wall and you can make reference to it throughout the year. We can also use the modal verb could, and this is often used for polite requests. Could you open the window, please? How many other polite requests can you think of? Could you pass the salt, please? Could I have a word? Could I suggest? We can also use could for permission. Could we go now? For an offer, I could take you home. Or maybe for possibility and speculation. It could rain later. Another modal verb is should. So how can we use should? We can use should for advice. You should apply for the job. We could also use it for probability. Sarah should be here soon. And we could also use it for criticism. He shouldn't have retaliated. Let's have a review of some modal verbs. Remember, the modal auxiliary comes first in the sentence before the main verb. Modal verbs are never followed by to, so you may hear students make mistakes like must to or can to, but remember we never follow with to. Let's have a look at some examples and think about the message of each modal verb. Can you open the door? So what's the role of can in this sentence? Can you open the door is a request. She had to take her sister to the doctor. This is obligation. She had to. I can drive a car. So let's think about can in that sentence. How is it used? What does it show? I can drive a car is for ability. We must ensure all safety measures are met. So if we focus on the modal verb must, this is used for necessity in this sentence. They may leave early. So if we focus on may in this sentence, what does it show? It shows possibility. We might go to the park. So again, we have the modal verb might, and this is used for possibility. What would you do? So if we look at the modal verb would, this is used for advice. You should tell the police. So if we focus on the word should, this is for obligation. Can I give you a lift? If we focus on the word can here, this is offering. Can you help? So if we focus on the word can here, this is a request. So think about teaching one modal verb at a time, especially with lower level learners. For higher level learners, you can give example sentences where they need to identify if the modal verb is being used for permission, for advice, for obligation. Categorizing tasks are also quite useful. And think about using mini dialogues and role plays using some of these key verbs, where students are talking to each other but deliberately using as many modal verbs as possible. Let's have a look at nouns. So what is a noun? So a noun or nouns are used to name animals, objects, or people. So let's have a look at some examples. The kangaroo. Kangaroo is a noun. The man. Man is a noun. And the cup. So cup is a noun. But remember, nouns can be classified in many different ways. So, first of all, we can have countable nouns. For example, banana or bananas. And countable nouns are when we can count them or when we can put a in front of them. So a banana, for example. But then we have uncountable nouns, such as luggage, baggage, rice, garbage, hunger, and flour, as in flour that you bake with. These nouns we cannot count, and we cannot put a in front of them. But you may hear from your students baggages or rices, because maybe it's different in their language. We also have proper nouns, which include the names of places, like Dubai or London, or days of the week. We have common nouns, and these are names of objects such as cup, glass, table. We have collective nouns, which are groups of objects or people. So a choir, a flock of birds. We have personal nouns, personal pronouns. I, you, he, she, we, you and they, which are used instead of a noun. And then we have reflexive pronouns. For example, himself, myself, yourself, in singular forms, and in plural forms, ourselves, yourselves, and themselves. So pay attention to countable nouns. Countable nouns are when we can count them or add an a in front of them. And uncountable nouns are when we cannot count them or add an "a" in front of them. Countable and uncountable nouns can be tricky for learners as they're often different in their native language. And this can account for language transfer, which is when they translate from their first language into English, and this causes problems. So again, you may hear students say, I have a lot of luggages, and actually it should be I have a lot of luggage. Let's look in more detail at countable and uncountable nouns. So with countable nouns, they're countable because we can count them. They're seen in units, and they have singular and plural forms. They can also have "a" or "an" in front of them. For example, that girl is Spanish. Those girls are Spanish. Some further examples of countable nouns would be idea, ideas, competition, a competition, competitions, plan, a plan, and opinion. We can also use key words with countable nouns such as a few, several, some, or a lot of. With uncountable nouns, we cannot count them, and they only have one form. They always take a singular verb. They never have "a" or "an" directly in front of them. For example, the water is dirty. The furniture is very modern. Some more examples of uncountable nouns would be advice, because we cannot say "an advice" or "advices." Bread, news, or knowledge. And we often use these words with uncountable nouns: a little, not much, some, a large amount of, or a lot of. So in the classroom, try and think of category tasks by raising awareness, by putting countable and uncountable mistakes in sentences for students to discuss, notice, and correct. Again, students may use them incorrectly because of negative language transfer and the differences in use between their native language and English. Think of questions you can ask in the classroom to help with countable and uncountable nouns. Can we add an S? Can we count this? Always try and get students to record words being used in their context. This can help them when they need to use it. Also, when learners are exposed to new vocabulary, encourage them to consider and make a note of, well, is it countable or is it uncountable?